Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I heard you've had a very constructive morning. My name is Stuart. I chair the House of Commons Education Select Committee. I'm joined by John Spierings, the Executive Officer of the Reichstein Foundation, who's come from Australia, so particular thanks to you, John, for being here. Jeremy Benson, the Director of Policy at Ofqual. Leslie Davis, Director of Quality Standards and Research at Pearson UK. And Joanne Harper, the Principal of the UTC Reading. Before hearing from our expert panel, you wouldn't expect a politician like me to do anything other than abuse that position by offering a few brief thoughts of my own. And I certainly agree that today's session theme, ensuring vocational education is not second best, is an extremely important one. For many years, successive governments have focused on helping as many people as possible to pursue an academic education, leading on to university studies. And we all remember the 50% promise of the last government, and then the current leader of the opposition talking about the other 50%, in which he was quite right. Those who take vocational courses or enter the workplace and who face lower funding and greater complexity in their choices. This country has traditionally struggled to give vocational education anything close to the status that it enjoys in countries such as Austria and Germany, which both noticeably have far lower youth unemployment rates than we have in Britain. And it was partly for this reason that the Education Select Committee's recent report on white working class underachievement pointed out a careful balance needs to be struck between ensuring that young people are given access to an academic education while avoiding portraying vocational routes as a second-class option. Our report included some discussion of aspects of vocational education, such as changes to qualifications and apprenticeships, as well as new routes such as UTCs and entry to further education, direct entry to further education at 14. And among the witnesses we heard from was the Sutton Trust's very own Conor Ryan, and he told us that 31% of young people embarking on A-levels dropped out early, 31%, which suggests that there is still a need for better signposting of the vocational routes which may be more appropriate for them. The Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission has recommended that a UCAS-style system should be introduced to make access to vocational education simpler. As a minimum target, organisations ranging from Ofsted to the CBI to my own committee have all agreed that we need to improve the quality of careers advice and guidance in our schools and colleges dramatically. In order to achieve this, we need to introduce greater challenge in the system so that school leaders can no longer ignore this issue or relegate it to the back burner instead of their focus on the qualification results alone, upon which too often they feel upon which they feel they're primarily judged. That challenge could be supplied through the development of destinations data, and although this may not necessarily prove as powerful a tool as some people have suggested, but the recent bill announced last week will ensure that that students who've been at FE, the HMRC will release data from there. So work is going on in government to try and make destinations data as useful as possible and provide that balance in the accountability system so that the long-term interests of the child, not just their short-term qualification results, are something for which the school is held to account. And also the actions of school and college governors, work can be done there to get governing bodies to take a greater interest in the issues of careers as well. We also need to ensure that young people are studying the right vocational qualifications. During our white working class inquiry, we noted that white children on free school meals were more likely to be studying for vocational qualifications that will no longer count towards the 5 A-star to C measure from 2014 as a result of the recommendations of the Wolf report. Professor Alison Wolf told the committee that this means that the reforms introduced following her report will make things much better for this group, as they were previously being entered for qualifications that employers do not value. Mind you, when I saw Alison the other day at the Festival of Education at Wellington College, I asked her to what extent she had been able to read the effect of the changes that she'd proposed, and she said that she struggled to know exactly how it had so far played out, and my committee, its last major inquiry before the general election, will be into vocational education. So I'm looking for pointers from you today as to how we should focus that inquiry, because given the general election and the rest, in truth, the time frame we'll have will be limited. So we'll either do a very high level inquiry or one that focuses on a couple of areas where we think we can add the best value in a relatively short period of time. For those of you, as I say, who might wonder why we didn't do more discussion in that report on this issue, it is because we're going to announce this vocational education inquiry. And with no further ado, I'll invite our furthest travelled guest, John Spierings, to open our panel discussion. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Graham. And thanks very much to the Sutton Trust and Pearson for the invitation to come. It is a long way. I'm still recovering from the journey. But I think it's really important, and I congratulate the Sutton Trust and Pearson because the focus on mobility is really important for OECD economies, particularly around really ensuring that we've got strong social trust, growth and prosperity. And I would say at the outset that it's not a question of either higher education or vocational education. It's really that we have to have both, that are both strong, capable and dynamic sectors. Now, I guess why I'm here is not because I'm working at the Reichstein Foundation, but it's because I spent the last 5 years advising Julia Gillard, first as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Education, and then the last 3 years of her Prime Ministership as the Principal Advisor in the Office on Skills, Higher Education, Employment and Industry. And I just want to make some reflections on what we did in Australia that could be relevant for the UK or for Britain, and really then some more generic points. So, Graham, you'll have to keep me to 10 minutes. I've got quite a bit to get through, so I hope I can do it with some clarity and brevity at the same time. For us, the really important question is less the question of benchmarking against Austria and Germany, which has been raised a couple of times already. Our benchmarks are more local, they're Asian. And in this context, we need to take note that everything is mobile, everything is tradable, that nothing, and particularly for a country like Australia, is certain. The air is not solid. Our benchmarks are Korea, Singapore, Japan, Chinese Taipei, China, and Indonesia. They're very powerful countries in terms of their spend on education and the future direction of education. The second point that I'd make is that the increasing marketisation of education across all sectors, whether that's higher education, schools, early childhood as well as vet, privileges private goods over public benefits. And we're seeing that played out in Australia where the attempt to completely deregulate fees in the higher education sector is being based on the returns to individuals rather than seeing education as a public good and the need for continuing public investment. And that's the same in vocational education where we're beginning to introduce greater debt and access to loans as a means of funding vocational education. The other point that I'd make, I guess, is that VET is unusual across the education spectrum. It's really at that pointy end where the public, student and industry interests come together. It's not so much a question of ladders and bridges, but really the sharp needle, I would say, because it's the sector that's most intertwined with the health of the labour market. And unless we look at the labour market side of the equation, then we're not going to make terribly many advances in terms of change. So just some points about Australia. We do have some real strengths in how we structure and finance vocational education. We do have a national qualifications framework. This is established through a key national body that represents all stakeholders. It provides certainty and clarity for students, for industry and for training providers, and it's a point of difference with our other sectors because universities are self-accrediting and schools, well, their certificates are awarded by the states. So it's the one sector that has clear national standards attached to it. Our qualifications are integrated into the broader tertiary education landscape. So there's transparency about how you can make transitions from one sector to the other, and about where qualifications sit within a hierarchy of achievement. Our training packages, which are the core units of competency in VET, are managed jointly by unions and by employers via industry school councils. So there's agreement across industry about curriculum. How adequate that is, I'll come to in a moment. And we do have really important innovations such as group training schemes that enable small employers, which was a subject that was raised earlier, to participate more fully in training and also pick up disadvantaged students. So these intermediaries reduce costs and act as an umbrella within our system. Importantly, within Australia, our apprenticeship numbers have held relatively firm despite the global financial crisis. And we also do have a very strong pipeline, potentially through 500 trade skill centres in schools. So that's a very strong foundation point for young people entering our vocational education system. So how does our system perform? Generally, pretty good. In terms of the trend, though, we have seen some quite significant changes in the last year, where the removal of government incentives for groups such as existing workers and for low-level qualifications has seen a decline in the number of non-trade commencements within our VET system, down by 90,000 commencements to 146,000 in 2013. That was a decline of 37%. But where the government incentives to employers and students remained consistent, trade commencements have actually increased. In terms of the spread and profile of our system, 40% of our commencements are in what we would call trade apprenticeships. These are in construction, auto, engineering, hospitality and so on. Really 3-year to 4-year qualifications at the Certificate 3 and 4 level. Importantly, we've moved to increase apprenticeship pay, so that now we've moved from 35% of the adult award in first year to 55%, and for those that age over 21, they will now get 80% of the adult wage. So that's an important reform within our system. It's a cost to employers, but it does mean that we're likely to get greater stickability by apprentices, and that's important for the next slide that I'll show you. And finally, on quality, in terms of those surveyed, we have very strong high indicators of quality. 80% of employers and over 85% of students express satisfaction with the training that they receive. And our apprentices do well in the broader labour market. They have lower levels of unemployment once they're employed, and they have high wage levels relative to those that don't have vocational qualifications. However, we have a number of weaknesses as well. Our apprentices are also employees as well as students, so the training experience is strongly related to the quality of the enterprise. So it's not just the quality of the institution or the qualification, it's actually the quality of the enterprise that we see as being really important. Many of our businesses do not participate within the system. Only 100,000 of our businesses employ apprentices and trainees, which means that across the broader employer sector, training is seen as a cost rather than an investment. But we do have poor data on exactly what employers are spending in terms of their training outlays. This relatively narrow base from which employers are engaged in training leads to free riding by many employers who pick off those apprentices coming out of businesses where employers have made the decision to invest in skills. It also leads to skill shortages and diminished opportunities for young people. Tellingly, despite the fact that we have a training rate of 12% in Australia, which I think is quite strong, we have low completion rates in terms of young people completing an apprenticeship. 50% attrition in the trades and 60% in other qualifications. And we have a very long tail in terms of literacy and numeracy capabilities, one of the lowest in the OECD. Interestingly enough, in terms of the announcement this morning by Ed Miliband, Australia does not have elevated trade qualifications or apprenticeship qualifications. We do have diplomas, but they are relatively small in terms of take-up and impact within our system. And careers guidance remains a really fundamental issue across all sectors for higher education, for schools and for vocational education. So what needs to be done? We need to build stronger public support for high-quality institutions of learning dedicated to vocational skills. In Australia, we have a very strong university system. It's ranked, in the top 5 in the world across the 39 institutions. But in terms of our vocational institutions, our technical and further education institutes, it's hard to say that we would rank in the top half of the OECD. And we look north to organisations like the Singapore Polytechnics, which really have made a substantial change in vocational education in a country like Singapore. In my view, and this is a personal view, not a view of the previous government, we need to extend training levies across different sectors to ensure that there's stronger employer take-up and that the costs are shared and that you reward successful employees. And we need to expand our group training schemes, which at the moment only cover about 20% of commencements. We need to end the free riding problem that I outlined earlier. Importantly, in terms of where VET is placed in the labour market, our focus on core competencies needs to be rounded out with a greater emphasis on problem solving, design skills and collaboration. Our TAFE and VET teachers are poorly qualified. You only need a certificate 4 rather than a university degree to teach in our institutes. And getting a Cert 4 is not that difficult to achieve. We need external validation of qualifications and providers. This is not systemic in Australia. And finally, I think we need new and powerful friends to champion the vocational education sector. The money, the endowments, the constituency for higher education is there very powerfully, less so amongst the graduates of vocational education. And we need to make sure that students, the successful outcomes, the successful apprentices are there as part of a powerful constituency to advance the cause of vocational education and stronger apprenticeships. Thank you.